Oh, hello. Welcome to Travel Trivia ASMR and another gentle jaunt around the world. If this is your first time here, thank you so much for stopping by. What we do is we look through a set of questions which, broadly speaking, have a geography theme. Certainly they're things that I discovered or I asked myself whilst on my travels. So there may be a little history or entertainment thrown in, but geography is certainly at the heart of it. So we'll be looking at maps, flags, memorabilia, and they won't be questions with one simple answer that we can rattle through in just a couple of minutes. Far from it. The idea is you can play this video as you relax, as you lie in bed perhaps, as you even attempt to go to sleep, and I'll go through the 10 questions one at a time and take the opportunity for some discussion and even to ask some further questions, some of which may not actually have a definitive or straightforward answer, but maybe invitations for discussion. And rather pleasingly, on this occasion, those invitations for further discussions will be all about the Russians. Yes, we are having discussions about the Russians, and it's going to be through the medium of a trip along the Trans-Siberian Railway. I'm roughly going to be tracing the route of a trip that I did in 2012, when perhaps we could say that the world seemed a slightly happier place. Certainly taking a trip across Russia was quite a common thing to do. I don't even know if that's very possible at the moment, but one thing I don't really intend to get into in this video is what has happened in this part of the world since 2012. So we'll concentrate on things I learned on the Trans-Siberian Railway and things that happened quite a long time ago. If you do fancy commenting on anything that I say, if you want to join with those discussions, then please do leave your comments, and as always, as we all say, your likes are always appreciated, and if you would like to subscribe, then that would be super too. Well, let's get into the questions. We'll see all the questions first, and then go through the answers. And a starting point for many a Trans-Siberian trip is Siberia, of course, and the showpiece attraction there is probably Lake Baikal. So, it's a freshwater lake. It's quite a large one. But how much of the world's freshwater is in Lake Baikal? It's quite a lot. We are travelling quite a long way across Russia, not quite all the way from east to west, but a long part of it, and we will be crossing many time zones. And so I will be asking, how many time zones are there in Russia? Question 3 takes us right to the heart of the railway story. Which English place name became the Russian word for railway station? That might be a bit of a tall tale, but it's quite a nice one. As we travel further west, we will reach a key place in the story of the Russian Tsars, and as I did when I was there, albeit briefly, let's ask, what does the word Tsar actually mean? Where did it come from? Of course, as we travel from the eastern end of Russia over to the west, we move from Asia to Europe. So where is the border between Europe and Asia? And we won't just talk about the border that you cross on the railway, but also the other parts of that border as well. For question 6, we will arrive in Moscow, and I will ask, what's the name of the colourful onion-domed cathedral on Krasnaya Ploshchad? You know that by a different name, by the way, and if you do speak Russian, I hope you will forgive my attempts at pronunciation. Oh dear, here's another one. Question 7 is, where do matryoshka come from? That is something that is, I think, synonymous with Russia, certainly something that you see at tourist souvenir places. Question 8. Well, we were never going to get through this video without mentioning a former incarnation of that country. How long did the USSR last for? I wonder if you can remember when it officially started and ended. And then, at the end of our journey, we reach the city formerly known as Leningrad, where I will be asking 2 questions actually. The first of them is, who wrote the Leningrad Symphony? And question 10, how and where did Ra-Ra-Rasputin die? A silly story to end our trip with. Now, as we go through, one thing I would like to attempt to do is to chart on my little map here the places I'm talking about. And this is a map courtesy of mapchart.net. If you're not aware of that, it's well worth a look for map fans, especially if you're a fan of making maps of places you've been. it's really user-friendly, and so I've used it to colour in the oblasts or regions that I think I went through. And I say I think because, of course, this is a very long journey, most of which I was in a train, and a lot of that was in the dark hours of night. So I can only go via some diary notes, checking timetables and maps, and we do sort of see the corridor that the railway goes through. It's only a little confusing here because the Krasnoyarsk Oblast actually extends from the city of Krasnoyarsk, which is down here, with the rest of the railway, and it extends all the way to the Arctic coast. I do not want to give the impression that I've been all the way up here, for sadly that would not be true. And you notice that I've drawn around the border of Russia in red and blue. You may be able to deduce that that's sea, coasts and land borders. So, of course, here on the northern side it's the Arctic. The Bering Strait over here, and then coming around to Vladivostok would be around here. If I were truly travelling the full Trans-Siberian Railway, I would have started here. You get a tiny border with North Korea here, and then China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan. And then that's the Caspian Sea, Azerbaijan and Georgia here, a little bit of Black Sea coast. It doesn't really look correct at this angle because of course we're so accustomed to seeing Europe with north at the top, but that sure is the Black Sea. And then the border, such as it is on this map with Ukraine, I'm sure other maps may show it differently, but this is what mapchart.net goes with. And then after Ukraine you'd have Belarus and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. The small inlet into the Baltic where Saint-Petersburg is, and then Finland and a little bit of Norway. Over here, a place that I haven't visited and therefore won't be talking about, but it's on the map, it's Kaliningrad, which has a land border with I think Poland and Lithuania, and then also a bit of coast on the Baltic there. But we start at Lake Baikal. Question 1. How much of the world's fresh water is in Lake Baikal? Well, at risk of getting it horribly wrong, I would like to draw roughly the route of the railway. I didn't come from Vladivostok. I arrived overnight from Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, so it would be arriving something like this, and then skirting around the southern side of Lake Baikal, disembarking in Irkutsk, and then taking a short road trip to a lovely little village called Listvyanka. And so here, let's attempt to write those. In a fashion which doesn't overlap with any line that interferes with it. I've drawn Lake Baikal on here. I think it's on the border there of the Irkutsk Oblast and this region here. It is a banana-shaped lake, and it is among the largest lakes in the world, I suppose, but not just in terms of the surface area of the lake. And I'd just like to show you a little something which I found in a little museum in Listvianka. Now, Listvianka is that village which is part of the common Trans-Siberian itinerary. And in the museum there, this is a photograph of a display in the museum, so we can't really zoom in too much and look at the information in detail, but what we can see here is the graphics, and I rather like them. I like the caption talking about information on some lakes. Haven't bothered to put any attempt into let's rank them in order. They've just presented it as some lakes. That's fine. Over here we have the Caspian Sea, which I am not going to consider as a lake in this discussion, because remember the question was how much of the world's fresh water is in Lake Baikal. Now, technically the Caspian Sea is a lake. It's not a sea in spite of the name, and that's because it's not connected with any of the other seas in the world. So technically it's a lake, but it's a slightly salty lake, and therefore it's not fresh water and can't be included in this question. If we look at other lakes, here's Baikal, you've got Tanganyika, which is in Africa, of course, Lake Superior, and Lake Victoria. And so you can see, just with that comparison, that Baikal doesn't come close to other lakes in terms of surface area. But the key thing is the depth there. And this graphic here is all about the relative heights above sea level, but also the depths of them. And look how far down Lake Baikal goes. Now, what we really need to confirm the answer to questions like the one I've asked is good old Wikipedia. If Wikipedia was invented for one thing, it's for lists of facts about sizes of lakes. And so, here we go. List of lakes by volume. And it too has the Caspian Sea at the top, but it is 1.2% salty, so not going to include it. The next on the list, and therefore the largest by volume of freshwater lakes, is Lake Baikal, which we see there has an extraordinary amount of water. Well, the volume doesn't really mean much until we can sort of put it in the context of everything else. So, what does it say about Lake Baikal? Here we go. Here we go. Lake Baikal is the world's largest freshwater lake high volume containing 23,615.39 cubic kilometres of water, or 22 to 23% of the world's fresh surface water. Ooh, there's a good fact. More than all of the North American Great Lakes combined. So, there we go then. I'm happy with 22 to 23%. I wonder actually if that is an amount that varies anyway, and that's why they haven't given a precise number. I'm just thinking, is there a finite amount of fresh water? Or would it vary slightly according to glacial melt? I'm not sure. Glaciers may just count as fresh water anyway. You may have water evaporating in different places at different rates, I'm not sure. I don't think it would vary to a great enough quantity to affect a percentage like that. But anyway, it's good enough for me. 22 to 23%, more than a fifth of the world's fresh water is in one lake. That is staggering, isn't it? And certainly while I was there in Litvianka, and both looking out over the lake from my hotel and even going for a walk along it and taking a quick paddle in it, I was merrily drinking the water, thinking, well, this is fresh water. This is absolutely fine to drink. I know as a tourist and traveller, one is normally supposed to be cautious about drinking tap water, but it seemed okay to me, and I survived. It tasted very nice. Now, as we move away from Lake Baikal, let's address just how big Russia is. How many time zones are there in Russia? And to help me answer that, I'm going to borrow this map of Russia. Isn't that beautiful? Now, someone has gone to the great trouble of using a thing like MapChat and colouring in all the different oblasts, the different regions, according to the time zone that they're in. And I'm just going to double check the name of that person. Who is it? It is a creator by the name of Sikevitz, and they have kindly put this on Wikipedia, and I've taken the liberty of printing it out. I'm even thinking of having it framed because it's lovely. Well, a couple of things jump out at me. First of all, we mentioned Kaliningrad, over here by Poland and Lithuania, it has a time zone of its own, which is 2 hours ahead of UTC or GMT. Then you get the huge red area, which is basically European Russia, including Moscow, and that's 3 hours ahead of UTC. Several of the regions, possibly independentist republics, I'm not sure, they have a time zone of their own anyway. This is the time zone where we find the Yekaterinburg, a place where we will be stopping later. That's 5 hours ahead, and then you get 6, 7, 8. This is, I think, where Irkutsk would be found. Or have I lost count already? 2 hours ahead of UTC, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6, 7, 8. Yes. So that's 8 hours ahead of UTC. That would be 9, 10, 11, and 12 hours ahead of UTC, which is over in Kamchatka. And so every time zone is covered from 2 hours ahead of UTC all the way to 12 hours ahead of UTC. And therefore 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 time zones is the answer to our question. And if you haven't ever been to Russia or thought about the Trans-Siberian trips, perhaps it hasn't occurred to you that there is a potential problem in railway timetabling if you've got trains running through 11 time zones. And so here's a little photo of how they resolve that. This is a departures board. As you can see, there are 2 times there, and I think that is, you see that says Moscow, and so I think that's Moscow time, 20:43, nearly 8:45 in the evening Moscow time, and here it's local time. That must mean local time, and as you can see, that's 3 hours ahead of Moscow. And so if Moscow time is here, then 1, 2, 3. Oh, right. So we're in that little area there, are we? I don't know why I'm so surprised by that. I was kind of expecting that it would be this area. But okay, it's that oblast there, which is 3 hours ahead. And I'm pretty sure that is the oblast of Novosibirsk and the city of it as well. And if we just have a look here, yeah, these departures are showing the origin and the destination of the train. So here is one that starts in Novosibirsk and goes to Vladivostok. So Novosibirsk is where that picture is taken, and was just putting in a little preparation earlier. Wait a minute, that's not the right pen. Now, I can't really claim to have been to Novosibirsk. I don't know if stepping out of the train just for a couple of minutes really counts as visiting. You're quite entitled to say no. But when you do the Trans-Siberian trip, it does get to several very large cities and tends to stop there for 20 to 30 minutes. So you do have time to get out, and typically you would go into the station to buy some food and just stretch your legs maybe. And so that's how I came to be actually in the station and taking that photo. But I didn't stray further from the station. The route of our Trans-Siberian trip then it's very approximate, but it behaves something like that as far as Novosibirsk. Which I've never really thought about that, but I suppose that must mean New Siberia, does it? Well, on we go to question 3. And since we are well underway on our Trans-Siberian trip, let's talk about some railway words. And it's like a little community once you get on the train. You have your own compartment, you're obviously going to be there for a very long time. This journey, which I'm currently making, started on Sunday afternoon at about 6 o'clock in Irkutsk, and albeit with stops at large stations where you could get out for a bit, that journey that started on Sunday early evening only finished in Moscow at 4:10 in the morning on Thursday. So what's that? Starting on Sunday, Monday evening, Tuesday evening, Wednesday evening. 3.5 days, give or take an hour or two, to travel non-stop on a train. And if you can afford to do so, and it's not that expensive really, you pay for a sleeper berth. If you're really into luxury, you can pay for a sleeping berth all by yourself or with your companion, but if you're a solo traveller as I was, then you just get lumped in with whoever you've got. And I was actually surprised to find that for a lot of that journey I had no companion at all, which was a little annoying since I'd stocked up on snacks in Irkutsk in the full expectation that I would have people sharing with me, and I'd try to ingratiate myself by offering snacks, but it wasn't to be. I was joined by a girl somewhere between Irkutsk and Novosibirsk, and she went as far as Omsk, and she got off in Omsk at, I think I remember that it was around 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning. So we're carrying on this far to Omsk. And that previous picture that I showed you from Novosibirsk Remember that was at about, it was just before midnight, wasn't it, local time? And so we travel through the night here, we end up in Omsk, and that is where I got out and I took this picture. A beautiful picture of a beautiful building. You can see by the light of the sky actually that it's just after dawn. But here's the interesting thing, which is at the root of our question. That is the Russian word for railway station. V O K Z A L. So let's just write that into our answer. I don't know a lot of Russian, but I have on a number of occasions attempted to learn the Cyrillic alphabet, so I can sort of read it, particularly when I know what it is going to say. And here it says Vokzal, Vokzal. So where does that come from? Well, according to one story, and you might want to take this with a pinch of salt, when the Russians decided to build railways of their own in order to expand east and take advantage of the resources, the mineral resources they were finding, they visited the place where railways had originated and where railways were really flourishing, and that was England. And according to the tale, the representatives of the Russian authorities were escorted by British politicians from the House of Commons, which is where the British government lives, over to the other side of the River Thames and to the nearest railway station, which is at a part of London called Vauxhall. We can see the connection, right? Vauxhall gives us Vauxhall, Vauxhall from Vauxhall. How did the word Vauxhall come to just be borrowed from English into Russian? Well, I don't think there's any dispute about the fact that it does come from that place name, but why is the question, and that's what is slightly disputed. Because when these people, these big wigs from the Russian Railway Authority were taken to Vauxhall Station in London, they of course saw signs at the station which carried the station name, hence Vauxhall, and they assumed that that was just the general word for that type of building, for a railway station. And they took it back to Russia and said, the English, they have this word for a railway station, it's Vauxhall, so let's write it in our letters. And hence the Russian word for railway station became Vauxhall. Now, I've heard that story in a number of places, but I have also seen it poo-pooed, and it's also possible that in that part of London called Vauxhall there was a place called Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, and this was a growing trend in the 19th century as well as railways. The idea of people having leisure time to spend in public parks was on the rise, and I suppose it's fair to say that those two ideas were linked, actually, because if you have railways, travel becomes more efficient, people have a bit more free time. And so Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens may just have been the inspiration for a different pleasure garden called Pavlovsk, which is in St. Petersburg. And of course, St. Petersburg at this time was the capital of Russia, and it was the go-to place for high society and for people who thought themselves fashionable in Russia and beyond. So, whether it's a direct lift from the railway station or whether it is a borrowing from the pleasure garden into St. Petersburg, and then the station at that pleasure garden was called Vauxhall, and that in turn became the generic word for railway station. I think there is some discussions, there are certain discussions with Russians about the etymology there, but we can certainly see from the letters that Vauxhall comes from Vauxhall. So go with whichever story you like. By all means, leave a comment if you do want to contribute any thoughts on this or any other question as we go through. I'll be delighted to hear from you. And so we travel further west from Omsk to the next place which I was aware of reaching was this place here. And so what time of day would that be? Well, it was Sunday when we left Irkutsk. It was Tuesday. It was Monday night in North. It was Tuesday morning by the time of Omsk. It would be Tuesday evening, or possibly the very early hours of Wednesday morning when we got to Yekaterinburg, and I was so disappointed that it was dark, because I was looking forward to at least seeing a bit of that city. And that is because Yekaterinburg is a part of the story of the Russian royal family. The Russian royal family, known as Tsars, of course. And I'm sure you know that the Russian royal family was abolished. The Romanovs, they were abolished, dethroned, ousted, whatever word you want to use for it. And murdered would be another good word for what happened to them. And come the Russian Revolution, which we will hear more about later, I'm sure, the Bolsheviks decided that it wasn't sufficient merely to have the Russian Tsars exiled or imprisoned, because if they remained alive, then they could fall into the hands of the opponents, or we might even say enemies of the Bolsheviks. And so if they fell into enemy hands, they might have been used as political pawns. And so it was decided, as I understand it, to kill them so that couldn't happen. And they were taken to a particular house in Yekaterinburg, and that was the end of them. course, none of this was known until way after the fall of the Soviet Union, so it remained a secret for however long the Soviet Union lasted. That is a precise duration which we will come to soon. And so when I was reading this story in Yekaterinburg, from the solitude of my empty railway compartment without a companion, I wondered to myself, this word Tsar, what does it mean exactly? Is it the Russian word for king? Is it something else? And the answer that I found was so pleasing that it's actually become one of my favourite things. And it's worth considering the alternative spelling of it, C-Z-A-R, because that brings us a little closer to where the word actually comes from. And in order to double check, let us have a look at the etymology. So, title of the emperor. Okay, so emperor, not king. Emperor of Russia comes from the 1660s. Well, of course, Ivan the Terrible was the first Tsar. He was a strange chap, to say the least. We'll hear more about him later as well. He was from a century before that, though. So perhaps Ivan the Terrible maybe he assumed that role, and the word Tsar evolved later. I'm not sure about that actually, but the TSAR, Tsar, comes from the Latinization of Russian, CZAR, which in turn comes from Slavic, TSESAR, Cesar. It's come via Germanic, and ultimately it is from the Latin. Wow! Isn't that just cute enough to kiss? I love that. The word Tsar comes from Caesar, meaning emperor. I don't think there's very much more getting excited about the origin of Russian words in this video, but you never know. It is the sort of thing which entertains me on many a trip. Well, on we go, and we're moving away from the slightly messy world of the demise of the Tsars and the ascent of the Bolsheviks. Don't worry, we'll be coming back to it. We're going back to a slightly less contentious matter of physical geography. Well, I say less contentious, it does concern a border, and I do wonder if any border at all can be contentious. Less contentious, or completely free of any dispute. But if there was one sort of border which you'd think, well, surely everybody accepts where that is, it would be the border between continents, right? Because continents are just there. Africa is there, Europe's there, Asia's there. Well, nothing in life is that simple, is it? So where is the border between Europe and Asia? Now I asked that question here because it said in my guidebook as I was taking this trip that just to the west of Yekaterinburg the train crosses the border between European and Asian Russia. And I obviously was pretty wild with excitement about crossing from one continent to another. Who wouldn't be? The fact that other people on the train were befriending each other by sharing vodka around didn't really bother me. I didn't really wish to spend 3.5 days getting merry. I was just content to sit with my War and Peace and my guidebook to where the landmarks were along the way. So you can imagine my disappointment again when it was pitch black outside as we crossed this area. But I assume that this map from mapchart.net, the lines that we see are the borders of oblasts, the regions of Russia, and so I suppose that border there is sort of prescribed automatically by a natural boundary, and that natural boundary can be seen on another map here. Now this is very exciting. Just have a look if you can at the words on that map. This map is taken from an enormous and heavy atlas of the world from Reader's Digest, which was published in, I think, 1988. And so because it is such a hefty book, and hence it would be cumbersome to put on the desk here during the video, I have taken the liberty of scanning it and printing it out. But we can see on the map, can you see for yourself that it starts to say Union of Soviet, and then Socialist Republics would be off the map here. We of course don't have much in the way of national borders to think about here, because we're talking about the border of Europe and Asia, and that's exactly what this map shows, because this is taken from a larger map in the Reader's Digest Atlas, which shows all of Asia. And therefore we can see, well, starting in the Russian section, a fairly straight line north to south, and the former name for Ekaterinburg is it, how do you say that? Is it Sverdlovsk? So that's just east of the border there. And so it follows the route of the Ural Mountains, and then it follows the Ural River down to the Caspian Sea, and then we see it going across the Caucasus, and I suppose that's the summits of the Caucasus, the ridge of the highest point of the Caucasus Mountains, and then through the Black Sea and down the Bosphorus over in Turkey. But there are several people down the years who have had other ideas, who've had other opinions about where the border should be. One, for example, is that the border came further north here and entered the Black Sea there. Another, at one point, probably during Soviet times, thinking about it, actually had the border down here where the Soviet Union, as was, now Azerbaijan and Armenia, meet the border with Iran. That was at one point in Soviet times given as the border between Europe to the north and Asia to the south. But this is the one that most people go with now, and it explains why Azerbaijan and Georgia can claim to be in Europe, and so can Kazakhstan, because there's a little bit of Kazakhstan just here to the west of the Ural River. I suppose it's all dressed up in what multinational claims people want to make, and what privileges they have according to which continent they're in. But the map certainly does seem to show us that the border which, at any rate the border that I crossed on the train, was in the Ural Mountains, then the Ural River, the Caspian Sea, the Caucasus, I've suddenly had a blank. How do you spell Caucasus? Is it A or U? Going to go with A. And then after that the Black Sea. And then we get into the Bosphorus. The section that's relevant to our trip, the Ural Mountains. I did read that there's an obelisk or something that's visible from the train, but perhaps I'll have to go back and check it out. It's a lot of trouble to go to just to see an obelisk, isn't it? Maybe someday. Now we continue, and remember that this was, when was it? It was Sunday afternoon, Monday night, Tuesday morning, late Tuesday night, and then so we continue through the night and through the day on Wednesday. And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure which route the train takes there. I know it goes up into this oblast here, so perhaps it goes like that a bit. And then on the final approach to Moscow, there are various routes that it could take. And once again, I'm not entirely sure which one it took here, because come Wednesday evening it was dark again, and I think we went through Yaroslavl because a lady came onto the train, maybe even at Yekaterinburg, and said, "Oh, I'm off to Yaroslavl," and so that's there. And by some means, anyway, we arrive at Moscow. At 4:10 on Thursday morning. And that is officially the end of the Trans-Siberian Railway, which may or may not find its route in a manner close to that. Vladivostok to Moscow is officially the Trans-Siberian Railway. Other bits that are extended from it, I believe, don't count technically, not just the Trans-Siberian. And if you've been going around calling it Trans-Siberian Express, then that's certainly not the correct way to think of it, because it certainly isn't that. It trundles along at about 40 miles an hour most of the time. So, as we have arrived in Moscow, here comes the next question. What's the name of the colourful, onion-domed cathedral in Krasnaya Ploshchad? Krasnaya Ploshchad. You've seen it. There it is, from my humble little camera. Not the most fetching photo you've ever seen of it, with the Queen in the background, but a typical holiday photo of the day that I was there back in 2012. And another thing you can appreciate from that, if you haven't seen that before, is there it is right next to the Kremlin. And what was the Russian? Krasnaya Ploshchad is the Russian name for Red Square, which is the square right here. So we've located ourselves. Now, Krasnaya Ploshchad. I think Ploshchad is the name for a square, and Krasnaya means red. But I gathered that originally it meant beautiful, and then evolved to mean red. So we think of red as being a Russian idea because of associations with communism and so on, but originally it just meant beautiful square. And the cathedral in it, the famous onion-domed church, is commonly known as St. Basil's Cathedral. I wonder if that's what you said. In Russian, it's the Cathedral of Vasily, the Blessed. Vasily is the Russian for Basil, I think. But technically, there's a much more complicated name than that. Most cathedrals do have a far longer name than you think. This one is called the Cathedral of the Intercession of the Most Holy Theotokos on the moat. I think if this was a pub quiz and you had said St. Basil's Cathedral, we'd probably let you have it. And speaking of letting you have it, there's a tremendous story about the guy who built that cathedral. It was commissioned by the first Tsar, who I mentioned earlier, Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible is said to at one point have had a large frying pan constructed so that he could cook people alive. It gives you a snapshot into the kind of gent that he was, and the tale concerning the Cathedral of the Intercession of the Most Holy Theotokos on the moat is also evidence of what a jolly chap Ivan the Terrible was. Well, if this story is true, that is, apparently the architect who built St. Basil's Cathedral did such an impressive job, as we can see for ourselves, that Ivan the Terrible had his eyes gouged out so that he could never build anything as glorious ever again. I think that has been disputed by certain experts who point to evidence of the architect building other churches later. But like all good stories, it's done the rounds and made it onto the tourist trail. So hence, it's a story that you are told when you do the tourism in Moscow. Am I allowed to say that I was slightly disappointed by the church inside? It is beyond question glorious to look at outside, but underneath all of these domes is each of them has an individual chapel underneath. And when I went in, there was a choir singing in there, and it was a glorious sound. It was a spiritual place, but there was no one big cavernous chamber which makes you feel small. And I think the power of some good cathedrals is the sheer size of the building makes you feel that you're just a little part of what we're all doing here, but there is something greater. And I struggled to feel that way in this church, I must say. There are other cathedrals less than 10 minutes walk from here which did have that impact on me. Over here in the Kremlin, for example, there are 4 different cathedrals. The Kremlin is the House of Government, it's residence of the President, and palaces, and who knows what else is in there that the public are not allowed in. Actually, I was surprised that tourists were even allowed in to visit, but we were, and that's because there were 4 cathedrals in the Kremlin. And there's also a cathedral further along the river, which was demolished in the Stalin days and then rebuilt in the 1990s, and that's called Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, and it's enormous outside and in, so it had a far greater impact on me than Old Basil's Cathedral on Red Square. But I think that's got to be the famous one, hasn't it? Now, we're kind of staying in Moscow for the next bit. And we're staying in Moscow in two senses, because Moscow is where I saw an awful lot of what they call matryoshka. And it is also where they came from. Well, sort of. It's sort of where they came from. But if you haven't guessed what they are, well, I suppose we're going to have to do that. And this is where I'm going to actually show you a thing. There's a strand of ASMR videos which do unboxing. So it fills me with great excitement to take something out of a box. I think I'm just going to pop a pencil or two here to stop that from rolling away. Ladies and gentlemen, the matryoshka is sort of what you see in front of you. You may be able to tell. That there's something in there. Obviously, this is not the classic look of Russian dolls, but this is basically what we've got here. And I'm slightly anxious here that this is going to make a terrible noise. I'm just going to move it away from the microphone. Oh, no, it was okay. I thought it was going to make a horrible squeaking noise, which is what it normally does. So, as you can see, my version, the one that I decided to buy, is a family of snowmen. And the reason I decided to go with a family of snowmen is it was either that or a set with Stalin's face on it. And although I thought that was briefly quite amusing, I didn't really see myself doing much with it when I got it home. Of course, it would have fitted in very neatly into this video, so if I could travel back in time I would snap it up, but there we go. Now the classic Russian doll's look, of course, is of a peasant girl wearing some sort of cape over her. Oh, I'm just having trouble lining that up now. A peasant girl wearing a cape. And I think the original one showed her holding a rooster. There we go then. There's our snowman family. I decided to go for the snowmen because I realised that they would actually serve a purpose as a Christmas decoration, and not just sit in a cupboard forevermore. The original Russian dolls were from a place just outside Moscow, and that's the second reason to mention them in the context of Moscow, because I saw them on sale there for the first time, and that's kind of where they were from. When I looked it up, I assumed, oh well, these would be lost in the mist of time. It would be an ancient tradition, and we can say, well, sort of yes and sort of no, because the official set of what we would now call Russian dolls, or the Russian word matryoshka, they were made in 1890 by a woodcutter, a wood carver whose name we know. He was also called Vasily, the Russian for Basil. I'm very anxious about trying his surname, I must admit. Zvyozdotchka. Just call him Basil. And he was actually working at a place called the Children's Education Workshop, which a rich aristocrat had set up. And they wanted to create a sort of a folk art centre collecting aspects of Russian culture. So that's why they had a woodsmith, and this particular wood carver, in collaboration with a painter, came up with the idea of these dolls which go inside each other. And that was as a place called, I do have the name of the estate. What was it called? An estate called Abramtsevo, which is in the suburbs of Moscow. Now, as for where they got their idea, were they the first ever people to think of the idea of putting a smaller thing inside a bigger thing, which was then in a bigger thing and then an even bigger thing? Well, we have to say that the answer is no. Similar dolls existed in Japan long before that. There's an idea of nesting eggs from Russia, which I suppose evolves into the idea of Kinder eggs, which are common now for Easter. The Russian nesting eggs were created, and also in China there's a very ancient idea of nesting boxes, one inside of another. So can we say exactly where the idea comes from? We can say that our friend Basil carved the wood and got his chum, Sergei, I think the painter was called, to put the paint on afterwards. But were they the first people anywhere in the world to do it? I don't know. I can't really decide. There's an old joke. Don't you hate the way the Russians are so proud of their dolls? They're so full of themselves. Let's just go with the Children's Education Workshop in Moscow, because after all, that's a splendid idea. Now, enough of this light-hearted stuff. It is about time we went back to the USSR. I'm sure those of us who travel as much as we can, we all have our little thing, our little thing that we try to collect, and this is mine. Wherever I go, I buy a hat with at least a representation of the country's flag on it, and preferably also the country's name. And I do have one that says Russia, but I have never had a happier hat buying moment than when I found this one in a souvenir shop I think it was in Saint-Petersburg. This is in 2012, so of course long after the USSR has ceased to exist, but they know a nostalgia market when they see one. Now, of course, we know this is Russian. These are Cyrillic letters, and it says SSSR, as in Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Although to English eyes, you just can't look at that and not say CCCP. I'm not the only one, right? The USSR was, when I was a child, the largest country in the world. And I remember thinking as a 10-year-old boy, when things started to happen, the winds of change came to the east of Europe, and the world as I sort of understood it started not to be the same. And of course, the modern idea of what is a country, it is a completely modern thing. You don't have to go back many centuries at all to arrive at an era where the concept of nationhood is completely alien to what we now understand. But when I was a schoolboy, I learned list of countries, I looked at maps, knew what the capital cities were, could draw the flags, and then suddenly loads of these countries stopped existing and were replaced with new ones. And I just didn't really understand, well, that's not allowed, is it? And of course, once you grow up and you realise that there's far more serious ways of looking at it, then the tragedy and the horror of what happens when a country changes its name or its borders becomes apparent to you. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about some of the darker side of Soviet history because I don't really think it's in the spirit of ASMR, but we can certainly say that there were several thousand, if not millions, of people who suffered under one regime change or another, and that was true when the Soviet Union started and when it finished. I should mention, by the way, that I did find some excellent museums about this in Russia, and I was a little surprised to find them. And there were some in Moscow, and there were some in Saint-Petersburg. And by the way, the train from Moscow to St. Petersburg was super fast, and I think a purpose-built, almost straight line, which is why I just drew one. I found two excellent museums in Moscow. One was the Museum of Contemporary Russian History. There was also a place called the Museum Park of Arts, or at least that's its current name. I think on my visit it might have been called the Fallen Sculpture Park or something. And I've got a super picture from there to show you. Let's see if I can find it. There we go. Check those guys out. There we have our CCP again, SSSR, and a wonderful bit of Soviet insignia, and then stars of the show, Lenin and Stalin. Now, of course, Lenin spearheaded the Russian Revolution, and that was in 1917, and the Soviet Union officially began on the 30th of December 1922. and it lasted until the 26th of December 1991. And so therefore, if that had been 4 days more, it would have been exactly 69 years. So what's that? 68 years and 361 days, I suppose. And that is clearly, of course, now more than 30 years ago. At the time of my visit in 2012, it was more than 20 years ago. And so it was a surprise, but therefore a delight to find that there were museums being very honest about the Soviet period. I mentioned the ones in Moscow. There was also one in St. Petersburg called the State Museum of Political History of Russia. And in the latter, in the St. Petersburg one, there was an exhibition which I think, well, they called it a permanent exhibition, but it was in 2012, so they may have changed it by now. The permanent exhibition was called The Soviet Epoch Between Utopia and Reality, and in that museum, and also the others that I mentioned, there did seem to be an effort by the curators to say, well, they tried this project called the Soviet Union, and in the end, it probably wasn't the best idea we ever had. And they had lots of examples of propaganda and reports from labour camps. I remember seeing examples of photos that had been doctored so that you could compare the original and the one that was later published in a different form with certain people airbrushed out. There were letters from regional leaders writing to the guy at the top, whoever it was at the time, whether it was Stalin or Khrushchev, saying, here in the regions we've noticed problems and we've fallen short of our targets. So all of this sort of stuff was evidently known, but hidden from the public and certainly from the international media. So it's all on show now, or at least a lot of it is. And there was obviously in Khrushchev's time in the 50s a distancing from what had gone before him, namely Stalin. And once the Soviet Union project had finished, then there did seem to be an honesty about how it had failed and why. So that was really, really nice to find out about in those museums. But it did leave me with one question, and I would like to pass it on to you, if you don't mind, particularly if you live in Russia or you know Russia better than me. I'm a little intrigued by how prominent Lenin still is in Russia, because you do see him everywhere. That picture that I showed you just now from a Moscow sculpture park. Well, this is a deliberate collection of sculptures that are no longer, statues would be a better word, statues that are no longer pride of place in public squares and so on. They've all been dumped in a park as a museum. And that's certainly true of Stalin. You never see public images of Stalin in venerated positions. And yet Lenin, you do. And his mausoleum is still right there red square, isn't it? So I don't really understand why, and forgive me as a one-time visitor asking this question. I did ask a tour guide whilst I was there. I said, since communism has now failed in Russia, why is the man who created the Soviet Union still celebrated in this country? And the girl said, well, I think we Russians just think of ourselves as a little different, and we respect the fact that Lenin tried something different. And that does seem like a fair point of view, I suppose, but I wonder if there's a bit more to it than that. So if you have a personal insight into what people do actually think of Lenin inside Russia, then it'd be thrilling to hear it. So please do leave a comment and share it. Oh, we just have 2 more questions to go, and we remain in St. Petersburg for them. And the first of them, who wrote the Leningrad Symphony? Well, Leningrad is, of course, the Soviet-era name for the city of St. Petersburg, and so that in itself might be a clue. I ask this question because one of the things I did in St. Petersburg, of course, was to go to a ballet performance. And can you guess who wrote the ballet? Yes, of course, it was Tchaikovsky. And the ballet, as I saw, was Swan Lake, his first ballet. Tchaikovsky was a resident of St. Petersburg, as was virtually every Russian composer that you could name. And of course there are so many famous Russian composers, almost no other country, with the possible exception of Germany, I suppose, possibly Austria. No other country has been so prolific, it seems to me, in terms of providing internationally known composers. There's even a famous silly song. It's from a musical, and I can't remember the name of the musical, but the song is called Tchaikovsky and Other Russians, and it's basically a list of Russian composers, and the joke is that the singer tries to get through all of them in as little time as possible. Lists about 50 in under a minute. It's famously sung by Danny Kaye, and I shall I'll put a link to a video of it in the description. It mentions all the big names, Tchaikovsky, of course, Rimsky-Korsakov, Rachmaninoff, Stravinsky, Shostakovich, and many more besides. Now, all those people that I just mentioned could well have written a symphony about St. Petersburg because they lived there. But Leningrad is the clue. Tchaikovsky was born in the 1840s, and so was Rimsky-Korsakov, so they would not have known the city as Leningrad. They wouldn't even have known Lenin, probably. I'm not sure. Possibly towards the end of Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov's lives, Lenin may have begun to be prominent, but certainly they were long gone before the Russian Revolution. I also mentioned Rachmaninoff and Stravinsky. They were late 19th century, born in the late 19th century, and both of them actually fled Russia following the Russian Revolution, so they certainly wouldn't have written the Leningrad Symphony. But the man who did was Shostakovich. He was actually born in St. Petersburg and born in 1906, and yet another excellent museum that I went to in St. Petersburg was about the siege of Leningrad. Do they call it the siege or the blockade? I think it might be called the blockade of Leningrad. We're talking about the period of some 900 days during the Second World War, when the Nazis had the city surrounded, and they of course wanted to cut off the access to the sea, the Baltic. They came via the land, and they basically prevented the rest of Russia from accessing their port on the Baltic, and they didn't attempt to invade Petersburg, Leningrad as it was called at the time, and the people survived nonetheless. What the Germans hoped for was that the city would starve to death. And there's some archive footage, video, photos in that museum of the blockade of Leningrad, and it's a very absorbing few hours if you have the chance to go there. And one thing I learned there is that the Leningrad Symphony by Shostakovich was so poignant because after it had been written, it was performed and broadcast live on the radio from the Bolshoi Philharmonic Hall in the centre of St. Petersburg, which I gather is on Nevsky Prospect, the main thoroughfare through the city. And it was broadcast on the radio as a message to the rest of Russia to say, "Hi everyone, Leningrad here, we're still going." And so it was a really powerful moment in that city's history and in the history of Russia. Now we stay with music in the loosest possible sense. We stay with music for the last question. And this is because we are talking about Ra-Ra-Rasputin. Yes, the very same. And just show you this little map of St. Petersburg. This is actually a photo I took of a tourist map on a sightseeing board. I mentioned Nevsky Prospect. That's the avenue going through the city there. And I went on a boat tour on my last afternoon, going around the river, and there were several canals. It was a designed city, of course. The city of St. Petersburg was built by Peter the Great in the early 18th century, and it was supposed to be a brand new, fashionable capital for a new Russia, a Russia that wanted to contend with the big boys of Europe. And so St. Petersburg was planned to be a beautiful place and a centre of the arts, and so it became. So that's where the Tsars lived, and there was a time when a certain Mr. Rasputin, Grigory Rasputin, I seem to remember his name was, he was a mystic who appeared to have some sort of otherworldly knowledge and healing powers, and so he got in with the royal family and he became so close to them, and we're talking about the days of the final Tsar here, Nicholas II. He became so close to that royal family that rumours began to spread that Rasputin was actually having an affair with the Tsarina. And this was just a bit too much for a group of aristocrats led by Prince Yusupov, who was married to the niece of Tsar Nicholas II. And so Yusupov and a bunch of mates got together, and this man's just got to go, declared Rasputin's enemies. But the ladies begged, don't you try to do it, please. No doubt this Rasputin had lots of hidden charms, though he was a brute. They just fell into his arms. Then one night, some men of higher standing set a trap. They're not to blame. Come to visit us, they kept demanding. And he really came. Ra-Ra-Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen. They put some poison into his wine. Ra-Ra-Rasputin, Russia's greatest love machine. He drank it all and said, I feel fine. Ra-Ra-Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen. They didn't quit. They wanted his head. Ra-Ra-Rasputin, Russia's greatest love machine. And so they shot him till he was dead. There speaks the wisdom of the great Boney M. According to the memoirs of Prince Yusupov, he was shot. That is to say, Rasputin was shot by Yusupov. I'm not sure if it was Yusupov himself or one of his men that did it. I couldn't get to the bottom of that. But shot he was, and it was in the grounds of the Moika Palace. And that is in Saint-Petersburg. These days it's been, I think it's known as the Yusupov Palace, because it's on this tourist map. It's down here somewhere by one of these canals. And I know that because I was going right past it on a boat as they told us this tale. I don't think they played us the Boney M song. They're people of taste. But anyway, it happened in 1916 and the tale was embellished. It was said that he hadn't been killed by the poison, so they shot him. There was even a rumour that didn't kill him either, and so that's why he was then drowned. But then the body didn't remain under the ice, and so it came back up, and they had to drown it a second time. And well, some of that is probably not true. The official narrative from the guy who wanted him dead was that he was shot. So that's what we'll go with. And if you do disagree with any of what I've been talking about, or if you'd like to make further comments, then I would be absolutely delighted if you do so, with the possible exception of any protests about the Boney M lyrics. You'll have to speak to somebody else about that. If you've enjoyed our little jaunt around Russia, I do hope you'll press the like button, subscribe to the channel, for far more gentle jaunts around the world. And I hope to see you again soon here on Travel Trivia ASMR. Bye for now.